Sorry, I'll try to.
All right, well, good evening and welcome back to another week of PPA 500. We are very quickly approaching the end of our time together. So tonight, what we need to do is we need to finish up the coverage of the material from last week to make sure you have all the information that you need in order to complete the midterm assessment. Remember, we delayed the due date for the midterm assessment by 1 week to allow us the opportunity tonight to talk about the theoretical perspectives on administration. That will then give you all the information that you need to do a good job on the midterm assessment. This information we're covering here in the first half of class tonight will then allow you to answer the questions related to scenario number 5, looking at classical and neoclassical theorists on the midterm assessment. Before we get into that, though, just thank you for Canvas essay number 3. I've gone through and reviewed all those, and everything looks good with all those submissions. Coming due then, the next 2 assignments coming up, your midterm assessment, which has been rescheduled to be due on October 1st. So that's due next Sunday by midnight. And then Canvas essay number 4, which is due on October 2nd. Canvas essay number 4 is essentially just a redo of question number 4 on the midterm assessment. And the whole purpose of having you kind of repeat that answer for the midterm on the discussion board is so that you can share your answers with your colleagues, and then you can have a dialogue about whether or not public administration is truly a discipline. So it'll also save you a little bit of time, because once you complete that question, I believe it is 4A on the midterm assessment, then you essentially have your discussion board Canvas essay number 4 already done. You just have to copy and paste it into the discussion area. So again, those are the 2 assignments you have coming due: midterm assessment on October 1st, and then Canvas essay number 4 and responses to classmates due on October 2nd. Where we are going from this point on in terms of our material is, again, the first half of class tonight, we'll talk about those theoretical perspectives on public administration to round out the information we were talking about last week as we were talking about the discipline of public administration. Then we'll take a break. Then the second half of class tonight, we'll move into our last piece of information for the course, which is the functions of public administration. And tonight we'll look at the roles of public administrators in terms of the formulation, implementation, evaluation of public policies, as well as the implementation and evaluation of public programs. Also tonight, we'll talk about what it means to be effective in public administration. How do we know when we have effective policies? How do we know we are doing an effective job of implementing public programs? And that will get us started on the functions approach to public administration. That's what we're going to start on with the second half of class tonight. Then we get back together again next week, next Monday. Then we will continue talking about the functions of public administration. If everything goes well, hopefully we can get through all that information next week, and we'll talk about the functions of public administration from the perspective of how we manage human resources. We'll talk about how we manage budgeting, how we manage fiscal resources. And if we get through all that information next week, then on October 9th, I believe it is, which is technically our last scheduled session, if everything goes well, we can then reserve that session for you to work on your final assessment. And hopefully that's how everything will work out. If we don't get through all of our information, if we have to finish up some information on October 9th, then we will do that. But hopefully we'll get through everything by the end of class next week. Speaking of the final assessment, I know you're still finishing up the midterm, so I hate to mention the final, but The final assessment is available to you on our Canvas sites. So if you're done with the midterm, you want to move on to the final, you can go and start taking a look at the final assessment. It's the same type of approach as the midterm. You've got 5 scenarios, 2 questions related to each scenario. In the second half of class night, we talk about policy and program evaluation. We will cover a couple of the parts of the final assessment, and then our discussion next week of matching human resources, matching fiscal resources, that will then round out all the information you'll need then to do a good job on the final assessment. The beginning of class next week, we will very quickly go through the final assessment, kind of like we did with the midterm. I'll take you through the scenarios and questions so that everyone is comfortable with what you'll be doing on the final assessment. Again, I will apologize in advance because we do have a very full schedule tonight. I want to try and get through all of this information this evening. And so I will be talking a lot tonight. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully in future courses, you'll get a lot more discussion and not quite as much talking head as you're getting in this course. But it's kind of the nature of a course like this, especially when we lose 2 of our live sessions due to the university schedule. Okay, so that's our housekeeping for this evening. So let's go ahead and get into this discussion of the theoretical perspectives on administration. And we'll talk about the development of the theories to understand public organizations. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about what is public administration. We said public administration is the study of public bureaucracies. We said, okay, well, that's great, but what's public bureaucracy? We said a public bureaucracy is a public organization. Then we gave a definition of a public organization as a formal and rational set of relationships. And so since the very heart of public administration, we have organizations. Many of the theories that we have developed to understand public administration have, by definition, revolved around trying to understand these public organizations. And we have a very long history of organization theory in the field of public administration. And we can date that back until the late 1800s. So we've got over 150 years of theoretical approaches. What we're going to do here tonight in the first half of class is we're going to present some of what we call the schools of thought. And so schools of thought will be similar approaches that are grouped together into different schools of thought, different theories that try to help us explain why organizations are structured the way in which they're structured, to try and help us explain what goes on in organizations, and to try and explain those relationships in those formal, rational organizations. So the way in which I like to approach this discussion of the theoretical perspectives on administration is to do it in a chronological manner, because by covering these different theories and schools of thought in a chronological manner, we can better see how the literature has evolved and how our thinking about public organizations really has evolved over the past 150 years. But as we go through this chronological development, I think probably the best way to organize it is to look at schools of thought, whereby we will combine similar theories together under the broad category of a school of thought. So where we usually begin our discussion of organization theory is with what we call the classical school of organization theory. The classical school of organization theory shares a couple main foci, but one main focus under the classical school of organization theory is a focus on the organization itself. So classical theorists will take very much of a macro level approach, where their concern will be how well are we achieving the goals of the organization. We're not so much concerned about individual employees, but rather we're concerned about achieving the goals of the organization, trying to make our organizations as effective and efficient as we possibly can make them. So that's the one kind of unifying theme that ties these classical theorists together. A second unifying theme under the classical school is the pursuit of a panacea, the pursuit of a one-size-fits-all approach, an attempt to come up with one best way, either to structure our organizations or one best way to organize the work that's going on within these organizations. But we're really looking for that magic bullet that one best way that can then be applied to all organizations to then again make those organizations as effective and efficient as we possibly could make them. So those are the two themes that kind of tie all these classical theorists together. When you go on and take your PPA 660 organization theory course, you'll talk again about the classical school. But when you talk about the classical school, you'll talk about several theorists. You'll probably talk about 6 or 7 different classical theorists. For our limited purposes here in 500, to just kind of whet your appetite for PPA 660, we are going to focus on 3 main classical theorists: Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, and Luther Gulick. And if you've taken an undergraduate public administration class, I'm sure you have run into these gentlemen before. They are kind of your big 3 of the classical school of organization theory. You'll see on the pictures on the screen at the bottom left, you have Max Weber. The middle, you have Frederick Taylor. And the bottom right, the gentleman with the very impressive facial hair is Luther Gulick. And those are the 3 authors we'll look at in our classical school. So let's start with Max Weber and what he contributed to our understanding of public administration, public organizations. Weber, as a classical theorist, was again focused on the macro level. He was focused on the organizational level. He was focused on making our organizations as effective as we possibly could make them to help our organizations better achieve their goals and their objectives. The way in which he thought we could make our organizations more effective would be through how we structure our organizations. So Weber really focused on organizational structure. He believed that if we structured our organizations according to what he called his ideal bureaucracy, that there was an ideal way that we could structure our organizations to make them effective and efficient. So this is his magic bullet. His one-size-fits-all approach was the ideal bureaucratic structure. So he would argue that if we structured our organizations according to the following characteristics: number 1, we structure our organizations so that they have a tall hierarchical structure, meaning that they have this pyramidal shape, where at the apex of the pyramid, at the top of the pyramid, you have one person who's in charge of the organization. Then as you move down the organization structure, you encounter more and more positions. So the vast plurality of people in the organization are going to work in those bottom levels of the organization. It's a tall hierarchy whereby rules and orders flow from above. So it's a very top-down approach to structuring an organization. In this tall hierarchical structure, Weber also believed in division of labor. He believed that we needed to divide the work up among all the different positions and people within our organization. Division of labor is obviously a very common aspect of even modern day public organizations. You think about even a political organization like Congress. Congress is completely predicated upon division of labor. You have division into committees and then division into subcommittees. We divide up the work. And Woodrow Wilson is very famous for saying Congress at work is Congress in committees, because it's very much based upon division of labor. Chances are in your organization, there's division of labor as well. You probably have a position description that describes the duties that you do on a daily basis. The duties you are doing will be different than the duties that someone else will be doing in the organization. We're dividing up the labor. When we divide up the labor, everyone then specializes in their own set of tasks. So the tasks that you specialize in will be listed in your position description, and you will specialize in those tasks. And the tasks that you do will be different than the tasks that someone else will do who has a different position description. Since our employees are specializing in certain types of tasks, they're doing the same tasks day in and day out, they then become experts on how to best do those tasks. So our organizations, because of division of labor and specialization of tasks, our employees in our organizations then become experts. So organizations are staffed by experts in the tasks that they do on a daily basis. In this structure, we also then have what he calls a unity of command, a chain of command. So everyone knows to whom they are accountable. So everyone has a supervisor that they are held accountable to. That supervisor then has a supervisor, that supervisor has a supervisor, and so on and so on. Sometimes in the organization theory literature, this is what we would refer to as a scalar chain. A scalar chain whereby everyone knows the chain of accountability to people above them. In that chain of command, in that scalar chain, supervisors will have a limited span of control, meaning that supervisors will be responsible for a limited number of people. So a supervisor may be responsible for 3 people, or 5 people, or 7 people. But we limit their span of control to make it more manageable for them to control their subordinates. These experts who are specializing in tasks in our organization are also professional career employees. Weber viewed employment in an organization as being relatively permanent. He viewed employees as coming into an organization with the intent of staying there for an entire career. He didn't really think a lot about people being free agents, kind of like they are today. And sometimes people will go and work in 10 or 12 different organizations throughout the course of their career. They may have 3 or 4 different careers during their lifetime. Weber thought that in his ideal bureaucracy, people would come into the organization, they would then be loyal to the organization, and they would stay in that organization for their entire career. So there'd be a lot of stability of employment in an ideal bureaucratic organization. And everything in an ideal bureaucratic organization is written down. Everything is based upon written documentation. We write down the rules, the regulations, the processes and procedures. Everything gets written down. The good thing about relying upon written documentation is it better allows us to treat people in an equal manner. So you treat people based upon the rules. And so everyone gets treated in the same way in accordance with the rules. Obviously, the downside, the disadvantage of written documentation is the dreaded red tape. And that's one of the concerns with public administration is that we just have so many rules and regulations. We have all this red tape that we are drowning in on a daily basis. But Weber viewed organizations, bureaucratic organizations, as being rational types of organizations. That he viewed them as kind of being the top level of rationality. Weber thought we should make decisions based upon empirical evidence rather than making decisions based upon what we feel or based upon what we believe. We should make our decisions based upon empirical evidence. And so he wanted to structure his organization in a very rational type of manner. And that's what then led him to the development of this ideal bureaucratic theory. Now, again, the advantage of ideal bureaucratic theory is that it's relatively easy to understand. Everyone knows what their job is. Everyone knows to whom they are responsible. Everyone knows what the rules and regulations and policies and procedures are. So hopefully it's very transparent in terms of what the organization looks like and what the organization does. The problem, obviously, with his ideal bureaucracy is there's not much mention here of individual employees. Individual employees are part of the bureaucratic organization, but they are working for the fulfillment of the goals of the organization. So there's not a whole lot of attention that's paid to the wants, needs, and desires of individual employees. And that is another unifying theme that kind of connects all these classical theorists together into the classic school of organization theory. Max Weber, when he was writing, we're looking at the late 1800s primarily for most of his theories. A lot of his theories found their basis in sociology, and so he kind of approached studying public organizations from outside of public administration. And that's kind of a common theme that we're going to see with a lot of our theorists. Many of our theorists come from other fields, and then we've applied their theories then to match our public organizations. But that's Max Weber. He's usually the number one classical theorists you talk about when you talk about classic organization theory. A second very popular classic organization theorist is our good friend Frederick Taylor. And again, if you've had undergraduate public administration, you're familiar with Frederick Taylor and his theory of scientific management. Frederick Taylor, whereas Weber focused on structure, Frederick Taylor focused on work processes. He argued that we can make our organizations efficient if we find the one best way to do jobs within our organization. He felt that we could identify the one best, the one most efficient way of doing every job in our organization. Then we could teach our employees that one best way to do the job. We could then monitor their performance and make sure they're doing their jobs in that one best way that they were taught to do the jobs, evaluate them based upon that. And then for employees who are doing the job in the one best way, we then reward them. We give them pay for performance. And that was a major element of Frederick Taylor in scientific management. You reward and compensate those employees who are doing the job in the way in which they're supposed to do it. If employees are not doing the job in the one best way, then you fire that employee. You remove that employee and you replace them with a new employee who will do the job in the one best way. Taylor, like Weber, had a poor view of employees. If you read any of Frederick Taylor's writing, you will see that he refers to employees in one portion of his writing, he refers to them as being boorish beasts. In another portion of his writing, he refers to them as being merely cogs in the machinery of the organization. If you think about a machine with cogs, in order for the machine to operate, you have cogs that have teeth on them. And then as they turn, one tooth then pushes against the tooth of another cog, which will then turn it. And then that tooth pushes against the tooth of another cog, which will turn it. And that's how the machinery actually operates. If one of those cogs has a broken tooth, then the machinery is going to grind to a halt. So Taylor says you take that broken cog, you throw it away, and you replace it with a new cog that will work. That's how he viewed individual employees, a very dehumanizing approach. He didn't care about their wants, needs, and desires. He cared about, did they fit into the machinery and were they doing the job in the one best way? The way in which Taylor would determine what is the one best way to do a job would be through these things called time motion studies. So he would literally stand behind someone with a stopwatch and he would time every single movement they took in doing their job. So the example he used was a very simple example of shoveling pig ore. So you had a pile of pig ore, you had an employee who had a shovel, and then you had a cart where they would shovel the pig ore into the cart. So he would time how long it would take them to take the shovel, put it into the pile of pig ore, how long it would take them to then pick up the pile of pig ore, move it over to the cart, how long it would take them to then dump the pig ore into the cart, then how long it would take them to go back to the pile and start over again. He would time every single one of these movements. And then what he would do is he would eliminate the movements that were non-efficient. And then he would only keep the efficient movements, collect all those efficient movements together into what he referred to as the one best way to do the job. Once through your time motion studies, you've identified the one best way to do the job, then you can go out there and hire people who have the skills to do that job in that one best way. You can then train them in how to do the job in the one best way. You can then monitor their performance, you can reward their performance, or you can get rid of them if they're not doing the job in that one best way. That was this whole idea of scientific management. Even though scientific management and Taylorism really has a very dehumanizing view of individual employees, there are a lot of vestiges, if you will, of scientific management that are still alive and well in our modern organizations. I'm guessing that you probably in your current position have a job description, a position description that describes the tasks that you do on a daily basis and probably the percentage of time you spend on each one of those tasks. That idea of a position description grows directly out of Taylor and scientific management. If we didn't analyze each individual job, do a job analysis, we would not know what to put into your position description. Chances are, if you're in the public sector, your position is a classified position, which means that it falls somewhere in the position classification system for the organization. Based upon what you are doing on a daily basis, your amount of supervisory responsibility, that will all determine where your position falls in the position classification system. We have pay grades and pay bands so that positions that are ranked higher in the classification system receive more compensation than those that are placed lower in that classification system. That all comes to us again out of Frederick Taylor and scientific management. So even though the literature has moved on from Frederick Taylor and has recognized that his dehumanizing approach to employees is no longer that appropriate for today's employees, a lot of the things that were created out of scientific management are still alive and well, even in our modern organizations. So again, when we compare Taylor to Weber, we see that one similarity is they are both looking for the one-size-fits-all approach. For Weber, it was the one best way to structure the organization. For Taylor, it's the one best way to structure work, come up with the one best way to do the job. Another unifying theme is they're both looking at the organization. What is in the best interest of the organization without much attention paid to what is in the best interest of individual employees. So that kind of what unifies them together. Weber looked at structure, Taylor looked at the job itself. Taylor was writing primarily in the early 1900s, and scientific management really began in the private sector. And these were theories that were designed for private corporations that were then taken in the 1920s and applied to the federal bureaucracy and applied to public organizations. So this is another theory that comes from outside the field and is then taken into public administration and transformed to make it fit the characteristics of public organizations. And the 1920s is really when we saw scientific management take off across the public sector. A third classical theorist that you will talk about in organization theory is someone by the name of Luther Gulick. Now, one of the main differences between Luther Gulick and Max Weber and Frederick Taylor is that Max Weber and Frederick Taylor were developing their theories outside of public administration. They're developing their theories more for the private sector. Luther Gulick, by contrast, was developing his theories within public administration. Luther Gulick is probably best known for his service on what was called the Brownlow Commission. And again, if you've had undergraduate public administration, you're familiar with the Brownlow Commission in the 1930s. In the 1930s, we had the FDR administration. And the FDR administration took a very aggressive stance to try and combat the Great Depression. And one of the ways to combat the Great Depression was to create all of these different federal programs to provide grants to state and local governments to help them pull themselves out of the throes of the Great Depression. When you create all these different programs, it means you have to have all these different organizations that you are creating in order to implement these programs. So we saw exponential growth in the number of federal grant programs and exponential growth in the number of federal organizations. The federal government, the federal bureaucracy exploded in size in the 1930s. It got so big that President Roosevelt was having trouble managing all of these different agencies, and things were kind of out of control. So Luther Gulick, as a member of the Brownlow Commission, wrote a reorganization plan that completely reorganized the federal bureaucracy. And we won't get into all the details of the reorganization plan, but essentially what happened is they created an executive office of the president, and then all the management agencies, all the agencies that were designed to help the president manage the bureaucracy, those management or what we call overhead agencies were placed within this umbrella agency known as the executive office of the president. That was to help the president better manage the bureaucracy. Also, because Luther Gulick was a big believer in this thing called the principal school, the principal school was also brought into how federal agencies are being managed. So Gulick believed that if we taught our managers the appropriate principles, Those principles could then be used to manage our organizations efficiently. Gulick believed that every manager, regardless of whether they were in the public or the private sector, engaged in these generic management functions. Like Graham Allison told us, public and private sectors are similar in terms of the generic management functions. What they do is similar. The difference, according to Allison, is how they do it. Well, here are your generic management functions that Gulick referred to as principles. Planning. All managers, regardless of whether they're public or private, engage in strategic planning. Organizing. We all have to organize the operations of our organizations. Staffing. We all have to hire people and train people to work in our organizations. Directing. We have to then direct their work efforts while they're in the organization. Coordinating. We have to coordinate all the different things going on within our organization to make sure that everything the organization is doing is contributing to the ultimate goals and objectives of the organization. Reporting. We need to report on our efficiency and our effectiveness so we know whether or not we are achieving our organizational goals. And then finally, budgeting. We all have to bring money, resources into our organization, and then we have to manage those resources efficiently and effectively to help our organizations accomplish their goals. Planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting is come to be known as the POSCORP School, the acronym of POSCORP, which also goes by the term the Principal School. Gulick believes that if we can teach our managers how to plan, organize, staff, direct, coordinate, report, and budget, that is what will then lead to effective and efficient organizations. So when you compare Gulick to Weber and Taylor, Weber looked at structure, Taylor looked at work process, Gulick looked at providing kind of this managerial toolkit that will then help our managers to have the correct tools and the appropriate tools to use in given situations. Gulick really did view POSCORP as being a managerial toolkit. And so it's similar to if you're going to fix your sink and you open up your toolkit. You're probably not going to pull out a Phillips screwdriver to fix underneath your sink. You're probably going to pull out a pipe wrench. The pipe wrench would be the appropriate tool in that situation. Not saying that the Phillips screwdriver is not a good tool, it's just not appropriate in that situation. Well, it's the same type of thing here. Managers then have this toolkit, and when they need to plan, they'll pull out their planning tools. When they need to budget, they'll pull out their budgeting tools, and so on and so on. So Gulick really looked at efficiency in organizations, really was predicated upon teaching our managers what tools to use and when to use those tools, when to use those types of principles. What really unifies all three, Weber, Taylor, and Gulick together, is that they, again, were all focusing on that one-size-fits-all approach. Either the one way to structure, the one way to organize work, or the one way to teach managers how to use tools in appropriate situations. So this classical school really was looking for that magic bullet, really looking for that panacea. But in doing so, our classical theorists really did not pay much attention at all to individual employees. They were much more concerned about the macro level organization. How can we make the organization effective and efficient? And with Gulick, again, his theories are being applied in the 1930s, if you want to look at the chronological progression. But even when Gulick's theories were being applied to the federal government, there were still some people who were out there raising questions. And they were raising questions about the dehumanizing nature of the classical school of organization theory. One thing you'll notice is that when every new school of thought emerges, it's going to emerge as a response or a rejoinder to some of the criticisms associated with the previous school. And the classical school, their primary flaw was the dehumanizing approach to individual employees. And because of that dehumanizing approach, we then had a group of theorists who then formed these neoclassical approaches. And by neoclassical is just a newer approach to classical approach. These neoclassical approaches that would put more emphasis upon individual employees and their satisfaction in the job and their happiness on the job. So once we start thinking about individual employees, including them in the equation, we move out of the classical school, we move into some of what we call these neoclassical schools. So when you're doing scenario 5 of the midterm assessment, question 5A asks you to select two classical theorists. So you'll be selecting from people like Weber, Taylor, Gulick, that would help the organization. And then in 5B, I asked you to select two neoclassical theorists that would help the organization. With neoclassical theorists, these are the ones we're going to start talking about now. People from the human relations school, people from the human resource management school, people from the system school, and then some of the more modern schools of thought that we've seen grow up over the past 20 or 30 years. So that's what we mean by the neoclassical types of theorists. So let's start with the human relations school as our first neoclassical school of organization theory. The human relations school, again, starts to value individual employees and starts to talk about communicating with individual employees and understanding individual employees as social creatures and the impact individual employees can have upon the success or failure of the organization. The first author we talk about under the Human Relations School is Mary Parker Follett. And Mary Parker Follett is one of my favorite authors because not only do I like her theories, but I also respect the fact that Mary Parker Follett was writing primarily in the early part of the 1900s, so in the 1920s, at the same point in time at which scientific management was at its heyday. And when scientific management was taking over across the public sector, it had bled over from the private to the public sector, there really was one person who was kind of a lone voice in the wilderness who was standing up and saying, we need to slow down because scientific management has some fatal flaws, especially in the way in which it doesn't consider the wants, needs, and desires of individual employees. And that one sole voice was Mary Parker Follett. The problem that Mary Parker Follett faced, as you might guess, is that she was a woman writing in the 1920s, doing academic writing in the 1920s, which meant that a lot of her male counterparts didn't listen to what she was saying and didn't read what she was writing. The truth of the matter, though, is a lot of the theories and a lot of the criticisms of the classical school that Mary Parker Follett was writing about in the 1920s were the same types of criticisms that some of her male counterparts 10, 20, 30 years later started to develop on their own. And so she was kind of very far ahead of the curve. There's no indication that some of the later human relations theorists were aware of Follett's writing, but certainly she was far ahead of them in terms of her ability to critique the classical school of organization theory. Mary Parker Follett offers us a unique way at that time to look at our organizations. She argued that we should view our public organizations in a similar manner as to how we view democracies. She said, we have a system of democracy. And again, you can argue how much of a democracy we are. Certainly we're very much of a constitutional republic with some vestiges of democracy, especially here in California. But Follett argued, we are a democracy. And when you view a democracy, there are a couple of problems that oftentimes emerge in a democracy, what you refer to as flaws in a democracy. The two main flaws that she identified in a democracy, number one, what she called passivity of citizens, that democracies tend to make citizens passive, and particularized interest. Again, a very common concept to us after we read James Madison and we read what Madison talked about in Federalist number 10. This is what Madison referred to as factions, these particularized interests. So let's deal with this idea of passive citizens first. So how does a democracy create passive citizens? Well, in a democracy, at least in theory, people have avenues for participation. They have ways in which they can participate in their own governance. If you want to participate in a democracy, you can vote. You can volunteer to work on a campaign. You can contribute money to a campaign. You can go work at a poll. You could run for office. There are a lot of ways that you can participate in your own governance. However, the method that people typically use is voting. And they use voting because if someone is a rational, self-interested actor, they are going to pick the mode of participation that presents the fewest costs, that present the fewest barriers to participating. Here in California now, under our new law, somewhat new law, every registered voter gets an absentee ballot. And so you don't have to go to the voting booth anymore. You can actually fill out your ballot from home. You can then drop it in a vote drop box. It's a very simple, very quick and easy way of participation. And that's how most people participate. So democracies kind of lead to passivity on the part of their citizens. Same type of thing happens in organizations where employees tend to be relatively passive in the way in which they participate in their own self-governance within their organizations. Again, James Madison told us about factions in Federalist Paper number 10. And so we know that anytime you have a democracy, the natural outgrowth of that democracy will be the creation of factions. Factions are particularized interests. And whenever you have multiple particularized interests, multiple factions, eventually they are going to come into conflict with each other, whether it be in society or whether it be within a given organization. So Follett says that conflict is a natural part of a democratic organization, just like it's a natural part of a democratic society. We cannot completely avoid conflict. We can, the way to get rid of conflict would be get rid of factions. If you get rid of factions, as Madison tells us, you get rid of democracy. So what we need to do is we need to learn how to manage this conflict within our organizations. Follett tells us there are three ways in which organizations typically deal with conflict among its members. One way is domination. One party wins, one party loses. It's what we call in game theory a zero-sum game. Problem with that, obviously, is the party that loses will be disaffected, and the party that loses will not want to play ball. They will not want to buy in to whatever decision was agreed to by the organization. So domination is the worst way to deal with conflict, according to Follett. Second way you can deal with conflict is a little bit better than domination, and that's compromise. In compromise, as we know, one party gives up something, the other party gives up something. By both parties giving up something, they can come to a negotiated settlement, a negotiated compromise. That's better than domination, but both parties are still giving something up. So now both parties are probably going to be somewhat disaffected and dissatisfied. She says the most appropriate way, and again, we're not going to say best, we're going to say the most appropriate way to deal with conflict is through what she calls integration. Integration is when two opposing parties can come into discussion with each other and can then, through that discussion, synthesize a new approach to dealing with the problem or dealing with the issue. She says, once you get people talking, once you get people communicating, you then have an interpenetration of ideas from one person to another. And that interpenetration of ideas will then lead to the ability to integrate all this information together, synthesize it into a new, novel way of resolving a problem. It's kind of what political scientist Theodore Loy referred to as the marketplace of ideas. Loy says our democratic system is a marketplace of ideas where people can, it's like you go into a marketplace and you can trade and barter. You go into this marketplace of ideas, you can trade ideas. You can have someone else accept your ideas. You can accept someone else's ideas. You can interpenetrate those ideas together and integrate them to come up with a new way to approach a problem and solve an issue. Integration is the most appropriate way that we deal with conflict. Follett says, but to be able to integrate and engage in integration to deal with conflict, you need to have an open system of communication and participation. She says it's incumbent upon organizational leaders to encourage participation, both vertical as well as horizontal communication and participation among all members of the organization. It's only through that participation and that communication that you can ever hope to get to this integration of ideas. Now, that makes a lot of sense, at least in a classroom setting, but when you take it into an organization in real time, sometimes that's difficult. The more communication, the more participation that you have, sometimes the slower the organization is to react. And so I think one of the criticisms of Follett is that if you're in a very contentious environment, whereby the organization must respond very, very quickly to challenges from the environment, you may not have the time or the wherewithal to engage in this type of participation and communication. But what Follett really contributes to our understanding of organizations is this perspective of the democratic organization. And if we can foster democracy in our organizations in the manner in which we foster democracy in our society, that's how we can have an organization become more effective and more efficient. So it is a very much kinder, gentler approach from an employee perspective than what we saw with Weber, Taylor, and Gulick in the classical school of organization theory. A second human relations organization theorist we typically talk about is Chester Barnard. And Chester Barnard was writing after Mary Parker Follett, so he's about a decade or two after Mary Parker Follett. And Barnard talked about the need, in order to make our organizations effective, we needed to get the compliance on the part of our employees. He said for leaders and managers to be effective at achieving organizational goals, they can only be effective if they gain the compliance and the acquiescence from their employees. Now, this is a far reach from where we were in the classical school. In the classical school, everything was top down. In the classical school, leaders and managers would tell employees, do it this way. If they didn't do it this way, they would be fired and then replaced with another employee. Here, Barnard is saying you need to recognize that you have to get compliance on the part of your employees. In order to be effective, you need to induce your employees to provide contributions to the organization that will help the organization achieve its goals. So Barnard really viewed the relationship between leaders and employees as being a very transactional one. And so if you want to talk about leadership, and you'll talk about leadership when you get into your 577 and your 660 course, this is the perfect example of transactional leadership. You lead by providing valued incentives to your employees, and your employees will then respond by giving you what you need in terms of effort and productivity levels to make the organization effective. So for Barnard, is really balancing incentives and contributions in order to get effectiveness out of your organization. So you provide these incentives that employees place a value upon. And then if they value those incentives enough, then they will respond by giving contributions through their effort and their productivity and their work performance that will then help the organization become effective. Barnard also contributes to our understanding of organizations by recognizing that there are differences between employees. And this is a big difference from the classical school. Remember in Frederick Taylor, employees were merely cogs in the machinery. So they were just cogs, they were replaceable. They didn't have a whole lot of inherent value. They didn't have a whole lot in terms of inherent differences between employees. Barnard recognizes that every employee is different. So these incentives that we are offering to our employees, not every incentive will appeal to every single employee. One incentive may appeal to one person, it may not appeal to another person. So you think about an incentive such as considering someone to be employee of the week. For one employee, that may be very important to them, and that may incentivize them to work harder and be more productive. Another employee may not care whatsoever about being called employee of the week, and so that's not going to incentivize them to work any harder or be more productive. So we need to understand the individual nature of our employees. Barnard says that each individual employee has what he calls their own zone of indifference. Barnard argues that if you ask an employee to take an action, to do something that violates their ethical principles, that violates their values, that employee is likely going to push back on that request. And that employee is not going to want to do what you are asking them to do because it violates their ethical principles. So he says we need to understand the ethical principles and values of individual employees and then endeavor not to violate those ethical principles, what he calls their zone of indifference. If you're operating within someone's zone of indifference, you are not violating their ethical principles, chances are they are going to be willing to do what you ask them to do. You'll probably get their compliance and get their acquiescence. However, if you cross over outside of this zone of indifference and you start violating their ethical principles, it's going to be much harder to get their contributions. And no pun intended, but Barnard says every different employee has a different zone of indifference, that every employee has a different ethical standard and they'll have a different zone of indifference. And it's important for us to understand those differences between our employees in motivating those employees to provide contributions to make our organizations more productive. So you can see for Barnard, he really starts moving us farther away from the classical school, telling us people are different. We do have to understand our employees if we want them to provide the contributions we need to be successful as leaders and managers. And then a third human relations theorist that you will talk about in your org theory class is our good friend Elton Mayo. And if you come from a psychology background, you've probably heard about Elton Mayo before, and you're probably familiar with his most famous study, the Hawthorne experiments. Mayo and the Hawthorne experiments wanted to understand the impact of a change in a physical stimulus on the productivity levels of employees. So he and his colleagues went to the Hawthorne electrical plant. And in the Hawthorne electrical plant, he said, well, if we change the lighting level, will changing the lighting level have an impact upon the productivity of employees? Thesis being that if you turn the lights up, then productivity will probably go up because people can see better and so they'll become more productive. So they turned the lights up, productivity went up. So that confirmed that hypothesis. They said, well, then if we turn the lighting level down, we would assume that productivity will go down as well because people won't be able to see as well, they'll become less productive. They turn the lighting level down and performance actually continued to go up, irrespective of the lower lighting level. So what that led Elton Mayo and his colleagues to understand is that people were responding and being more productive, not because of the lighting level, but rather because they were being watched, because they were being talked to, because the researchers were asking them how they felt. And this really a recognition of the social aspect of organizations, that employees are social creatures. And if we want to get contributions out of those employees to make our organizations more productive, we are going to have to recognize the social needs of those employees. That, again, is very far afield from what the classical theorists were telling us. The classical theorists were not concerned at all about the social aspects of organizations. Here, Mayo was telling us we need to pay attention to those social aspects if we want our organizations to be productive and effective. Another thing that Mayo and his colleagues saw in the Hawthorne experiments is they broke employees up into groups. And what they saw is there was a lot of group pressure. So they created a group, say a group of 5 employees. If one of those employees was not pulling their weight, one of those employees was not working hard enough and not being productive enough, then it made the rest of the group look bad. So the rest of the group would then put pressure on that individual, make that individual work harder so that the group would look better. That then led Mayo to recognize the importance of groups within organizations, that organizations are more than just their formal organization structure, like Weber told us. Organizations are also made up of formal as well as informal groups that are oftentimes outside of that normal organization structure. We need to recognize the importance of those informal groups and the impact that they may have on productivity and the effectiveness of the organization. So you can see with Follett, Barnard, and Mayo, we are now starting to recognize the importance of knowing our employees and recognizing the differences between our employees far more so than what we saw in the classical school. But before we leave the human relations school, one caveat to add here is when I talk about Mary Parker Follett, I talk about her as part of the human relations school. Some people will talk about her more as a pre-human relations theorist, just because of the period of time in which she was writing. She was writing more in the 1920s, whereas Barnard and Mayo were more in the 1930s, 1940s, and even into the 1950s. So she really predated Barnard and Mayo. So when you get to your 660 class, your instructor may talk about her as a pre-human relations theorist. I put her in the human relations school because it really, I think, highlights some of the differences between her theories and Barnard's theories and Mayo's theories as compared to the classical school. And her writing really came as a response and criticism to the writings of the classical theorists. So that's what we call the human relations school. Now, one thing to note in the human relations school is that the major advantage in the human relations school is, again, they're taking into account individual employees far more so than what happened in the classical school. However, the question was, why are they doing that? Yes, they're taking into account individual employees, their social needs, their need to self-govern and be involved in self-determination, but they're doing it in order to get contributions from those employees to make the organization more effective. The ultimate goal among human relations theorists was still organizational effectiveness. The ultimate goal was still a macro level goal as opposed to the micro level of trying to foster individual growth and development for the sake of individual growth and development. So some later authors like Maslow, McGregor, Ardress, some of these what we call human resource management authors, took issue with the human relations school and felt that it was relatively exploitative, that they were exploiting workers, getting contributions from them for the mere purpose of making the organization more productive rather than helping those individual employees develop as human resources. So because of that criticism of the human relations school, we see another neoclassical school developed known as human resource management school. And the human resource management school, to take an old phrase from John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, and to kind of modify it a little bit, in the human resource management school, we're asking not just to ask what the individual can do for the organization, but then to also ask what can the organization do for the individual employee. And so that's a very important change. Now we're not just saying what can the individual give to the organization. Now we're asking what can the organization help the individual? How can it help the individual develop as a human resource? So in human resource management school, the three primary authors that we talk about in this class are Abraham Maslow, Douglas McGregor, and Chris Ardress. Abraham Maslow is another one that comes from the field of psychology. And so here's another theory that's being developed outside of public administration and then being taken and applied to public administration, public organizations. You're probably very familiar with Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs. This is really kind of a staple of psychology. In Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he argues to us that there is kind of this pyramidal hierarchy of needs that individual employees or individual people have. People have physiological needs. They have needs such as food and shelter and water and clothing. The basic needs to keep people alive on a daily basis are these physiological needs. People then also have safety needs. They have the need to feel safe from harm. Then at the third level up there, you have belonging needs. They have the need to feel that they belong to something. They belong to a family. They belong to a group. They belong to an organization. Again, this recognition that people are social animals and they need to really feel that they belong to something. Next level up in the hierarchy are esteem needs. People need to feel that they're held in high esteem and in high respect by their colleagues and their family and their friends and their supervisors. And at the very apex of the hierarchy of needs is self-actualization. Self-actualization is the ability to become all that you can be, to grow to your fullest potential. So those are the 5 levels of needs and what Maslow calls his hierarchy of needs. And this is his classical hierarchy of needs. The bottom needs, like physiological safety, belonging, esteem needs, those are what are referred to as deficiency needs, and that people are motivated by a deficiency in these needs. So if you don't have enough food, you are motivated to get an adequate amount of food. Once you achieve that adequate amount of food, then at that point in time, that no longer serves as a motivator for you. Once you have enough water, it no longer serves as a motivator for you. So for deficiency needs, once the deficiency is rectified, it will no longer be a motivator. The top need, though, self-actualization is, and there it says being needs. I like to call it a growth need. And self-actualization is a growth need, meaning that you're not really filling a deficiency, but you're motivated by the continued desire to grow as a human being. So you're always going to be motivated to try and learn more. You're always going to be motivated to aspire to higher level positions, to try and become all that you can be and to self-actualize, as Maslow calls it. The importance of this hierarchy of needs is it provides us with some insight into what motivates our employees, but also it's important to point out that these 5 different levels may change depending upon the individual. So for every individual, those 5 needs are not arrayed in that same pyramid. I mean, that's kind of the typical array of those needs, but not every individual employee has the same ordering to their hierarchy of needs, which again, like Barnard, places an emphasis on getting to know your employees and treating your employees differently depending upon their wants, needs, and desires. Now, I said this is the classical Maslow hierarchy of needs. I should point out to you that later on in his life, very near the end of his career in his life, Maslow went back and kind of revisited this hierarchy of needs and actually changed the hierarchy of needs a bit. And in his revised hierarchy of needs, that apex of self-actualization, he actually transformed that into kind of a feeling of giving back to your community and kind of the legacy that you leave for others. And that kind of took the place of this self-actualization. Maslow said that the old self-actualization was very much an individual type of motivation. And he felt that as people aged and as people approached the later stages of their life, they became more concerned about what they were giving to their community and what type of, again, legacy they were leaving to make their community and their world a better place. And so that's kind of the way he kind of changed it up and kind of revised it a little bit later on in life. But again, the importance of the hierarchy of needs, everyone may have a different hierarchy. And if you can really focus on those growth needs like self-actualization, that's how you can help people grow as human resources rather than just trying to fill their deficiencies. Someone who liked Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs a lot was Douglas McGregor. And Douglas McGregor, doing a lot of his writing to apply directly into public administration, built off of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and developed what he called the theory X and theory Y. And you probably, if you again had undergraduate public administration, you're familiar with McGregor's theory X and theory Y. Theory X and theory Y speak to the nature of individual human beings. And according to McGregor, there are 2 ways in which you can view individuals. Theory X views individuals as being very lazy, being very unmotivated, being very uncreative, not innovative, not wanting to work. It's a very dim view of individuals. Theory X view of individuals is kind of similar to the view of individuals that someone like Frederick Taylor or Max Weber would have had back in the classical school. Contrast that to theory Y. Theory Y is just the complete opposite, diametrically opposed. Theory Y says that people are ready to work, people are smart, people are creative, people are innovative, people really aspire to higher level positions and they want to develop more accountability and more responsibility. It's a much more positive view of individual employees. McGregor said, here's the problem. The problem is that the majority of our employees in our organizations are theory Y employees. Now, not everybody. There are a few clunkers in every organization, but for the most part, McGregor said the majority of employees are theory Y employees. The problem is they are working in theory X classical organizations. So we are taking theory Y employees and shoehorning them into classical theory X organizations. And that's a problem because if they're working in theory X organizations, there are not opportunities for them to be innovative. There are not opportunities to be creative. There are not opportunities to aspire to higher level positions and aspire to gain more responsibility and accountability. So there's a mismatch between our organizations and our employees. So McGregor argues the way in which you address that mismatch is that you have to take your Theory X organizations and transform them into Theory Y organizations. The way in which you can transform them from Theory X into Theory Y is through things that he referred to as job enrichment. So as we said, most people have a position description. That position description will describe the types of things that you are doing on a daily basis, the amount of time you spend, percentage of your time you spend on those tasks, and the type of training that you need in order to do those tasks on a daily basis. McGregor argues that we need to include our employees in revising those descriptions to enrich them. And you enrich them by asking your employees, what do you want to be? What do you want to, in 5-10 years from now? What types of position do you want to be in? What types of skills do you want to develop in order to aspire to these higher level positions? And then you enrich their jobs by providing with those opportunities to acquire and develop those skills to help them develop as human resources. And in helping them develop as human resources, yes, that development may help the organization, but we're more focused on what the development means for the individual employee. That if you provide training to people and you provide them with PD and they develop as human resources, and then they then take these skills and they move on to another organization, in human resource management theory, that is okay, because you have helped that person develop as a human resource. It's no longer all about what the employee can do for the organization. Now we're also asking the two-way street of what can the organization do for the employee. So you can see we are now very far away from classical theory. We're now doing things as an organization for the purpose of helping our employees, even if that does not contribute to the long-term productivity of the organization. And Chris Ardress, our third human resource management theorist, was a student of Douglas McGregor. So he took McGregor's theories and he built on them with what he called his personal growth theory. And according to Chris Ardress in his personal growth theory, every individual goes through a maturation process. As they progress through this personal growth arc, through this maturation process, they tend to start taking on a longer time perspective. So rather than only being concerned about next week or next month, they're now concerned about the future. They're concerned about 10, 15, 20 years in the future. They're concerned about the next generation. They take a much longer time perspective. Also, during this personal growth process, people also start aspiring for more responsibility. They want to take on more responsibility. They want to learn more skills. They aspire to what we call superordinate positions. They aspire to leadership and management positions. And that's all part of this personal growth process that people go through. According to Ardress, it's up to the organization to help people through that personal growth process. So if they are aspiring to superordinate positions, it's incumbent on the organization to provide them with opportunities to develop the skills that will allow them to move into those higher level leader and management positions. Again, it's more about what the organization can do for the employee as opposed to what the employee can do for the organization. And that's really the big difference between this human resource management school as compared to the human relations school. But one deficiency that we see in the human resource management school that is also true in the human relations school as well as the classical school is that we are looking at organizations kind of in isolation. We're looking at organizations as singular types of institutions without really recognizing the system in which these organizations exist. We talked about Graham Allison and differences between public and private sector organizations. One of the main differences that we talked about was the political environment in the public sector. We said the environment is so much more political in the public sector, and that has a major impact upon what we do and how we do it in our public sector organizations. That's an example of systems theory, looking at where the organization is in its environment and how the organization is impacted by the environment, and then how the organization can actually have an impact upon its environment. So in systems theory, we're taking a much bigger view, looking beyond the walls of the organization, looking at where the organization resides in a much bigger system of influences. There are two approaches to systems theory that are usually talked about in the literature. The first is what's called a closed, sometimes it's called a natural systems theory, and the second approach is open systems theory. In closed or natural systems theory, we liken organizations to living organisms. And so I don't want to depress you too much on a Monday evening, but with living organisms, from the moment that a living organism comes into existence, that living organism tends to start the decaying process and will eventually start dissipating energy and resources out into its environment until it no longer has enough energy and resources to sustain itself, and it'll then go out of existence. That process of dissipating energy and resources out into the system, out into the environment, is what's known as the process of entropy. Entropy is dissipating energy until that organism or that institution no longer has the amount of energy left in order to continue to survive. For closed natural systems theorists, when they look at an organization similar to a living organism, they assume that every organization has a birth and every organization has a death. And between birth and death, that organization will go through this entropy process. Open systems theorists contend that it's not necessarily a one-way street. It's not necessarily that organizations will go through entropy and will dissipate energy into their environment until they go out of existence. We know there are some organizations that don't go out of existence. There are some organizations that have survived for 200 years in this country and still continue to survive and still continue to thrive. So why do some organizations survive while others do not? It's because those organizations that survive engage in what's called negative entropy, in that the energy and the resources that they dissipate into their environment, into the system, they recoup by importing new energy and new resources from the environment. It's no longer this one-way street, it's now a two-way street. It's not only that they lose energy to their environment, but they also import new energy in. Some of that new energy, some of those new resources they can get from the environment are things such as, an adequate labor pool, bring new people with new thoughts and skills into the organization that keeps the organization young. Resources in terms of money and appropriations they can bring into their organization. Political support they can bring into their organization. Support from citizens and constituent groups also is energy and resources that can be brought into the organization. And by bringing all these resources in, you engage in this negative entropy, which then allows the organization to survive. In open systems theory, again, we're looking at that two-way street. How does the organization affect the environment, and how does the environment affect the organization? I think this is an open systems theory is a very appropriate theory for most of our public organizations. It is actually relatively difficult to find a public organization that does not operate within an open system, that is not influenced in some way by its environment, and doesn't also then in other ways influence its environment as well. That's very difficult to find in a public organization. So I think open systems theory has really contributed a lot to our understanding of our organizations by taking into account what the surrounding environment and systems mean for what our organizations are doing and how they are doing them. Systems theory, we're talking of chronologically 1960s, 70s, and into the 1980s. Then we also have what we consider to be the more modern schools of thought. And because we have very limited time here in this class, we're only going to pull out and focus on one of those modern schools. And that's the school of organization culture. When you get into your organization theory class, you'll talk about a lot of other more modern theories. You'll talk about quality management, You'll talk about leadership theories. You'll talk about a lot of different modern theories. The one we just kind of want to give you a taste of here in this class is a modern theory known as organization culture. Organization culture comes to us from an author by the name of Sheen, and Sheen makes the argument that every organization has its own unique culture. Question then is, well, what is a culture? And I know I've been talking a lot tonight, and so let me ask you, what do you think a culture is? When I say the word culture, what do you think of? What's a culture? What are the elements of culture? Charles says attitudes, absolutely. Attitudes, opinions, perspectives. See, Stephanie says a group of people, I gotta move my text here, a group of people with similar values. Absolutely. Culture is about values, the types of things we value, the expectations we have in terms of how we interact with each other, manifestation of human intellectual achievement. And with a culture, we're really looking at this idea of what do we value as a society? How do we expect ourselves to behave? How do we expect others to behave? What are our expectations for ourselves and for others? And that's kind of a culture. It's a set of beliefs, as Stephen says. And so every society has its own culture. In a similar manner, every organization has its own culture as well. So, Organization Culture School says that we can study our organizations by trying to determine what the culture of those organizations looks like. And so here we're kind of borrowing some approaches from the world of anthropology and archaeology. And so if you go out on an archaeological dig and you want to learn about the culture of an ancient society, you're going to dig up artifacts. And so you might dig up an eating utensil, you might dig up a bowl, you might dig up some paintings and some drawings. Those artifacts are tangible representations of what that society valued, the expectations of that society, how that society carried out its business on a daily basis, how people interacted with each other. Again, the manifestation of their intellectual achievement. All of that, you can get some of it from those tangible artifacts that you're digging out of the ground. In a similar manner, organizations produce tangible artifacts as well. And some tangible artifacts of organization culture can be things such as agendas from meetings, the minutes from meetings, policy and procedure manuals. Those are written, tangible artifacts that we can study to understand how that organization did its business on a daily basis, what its expectations were, and what its values were. That is the clearest and the most obvious manifestation of organization culture. However, there's a couple more levels of culture that we can study as well. So at a level below artifacts, we have what is called espoused values. And I have that on the screen, but I'll type it again. Espoused values. Espoused values, when the organization tells you this is what we place a value upon. So with the espoused value, we're saying, here is our mission statement. Here is our vision statement. This is what we are all about. This is what we believe in. This is what we are trying to achieve. And again, with artifacts, we're talking about tangible things like agendas, minutes from meetings, policy and procedure manuals. Those very tangible things we can get our hands on and we can read. Those are really what we consider to be artifacts. Espoused values is when the organization tells you what their values are, what they believe in, what they're in business for, if you want to say in business for, what their purpose is in life. Essentially, those are those espoused values. Those are also something we can see. We can see the mission statement, we can see the vision statement, we can see those things. At the deepest level and the most difficult level to study organization culture, we have what are called basic assumptions. And basic assumptions are assumptions that everyone lives by in the organization. We don't really verbalize, we don't really talk a lot about it. And so we all assume that we are going to treat each other with fairness. We're going to treat each other in a professional, cordial, and collegial way. We assume that, but unless we have a written civility code, we're not really going to write it down. We just assume that is how we are going to treat each other. Basic assumptions of organization culture are much more difficult to study because, again, they're not tangible, they're not written down. People aren't necessarily telling you that. You have to watch their behaviors, you have to observe their behaviors to see what those basic assumptions look like. Leaders have the ability to embed culture into their organizations. They have the ability to embed the culture they want into their organization. And when you study organization culture, you'll see that there are what we call primary and secondary embedding mechanisms. So sometimes you'll have a leader coming in that wants to embed a culture into the organization, and they'll do it through the use of slogans. So they'll come up with a slogan that will represent how they think everyone should behave in the organization. And that slogan then is the primary embedding mechanism that is then used to embed that culture in the organization. A more secondary embedding mechanism could be something such as how we treat employees and what we reward as managers. And so employees will watch and they'll see what do employers prioritize, what do they reward versus what do they penalize. And then that will then give clues to what type of behavior is expected on the part of those leaders and those managers. But I think organization culture is a fascinating way to study organizations because it recognizes that every organization is different, a much more situational approach to how we study and understand our organizations. And this is a great illustration of how far we have come in the evolution of organization theory literature. With the classical school, we are looking at the one size fits all approach. Even to a degree in the human relations school, we also are kind of looking for that one size fits all approach. And then we start to transform more into recognizing that individual employees are different and they need to be treated differently. They have different aspirations, they have different things they're trying to achieve. And so maybe there isn't that one size fits all approach. Maybe it's a much more contextual type of an approach. And then you fast forward into organization culture, and we have now come very far away from classical school, and we recognize every organization is different. And so the theories and the approaches we apply will depend upon the context of the situation in which we are dealing. Essentially, it's the death of the one size fits all approach to understanding our public organizations. Again, this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg and kind of whet your appetite for the PPA 660 organization theory class. Once you get into organization theory, you are going to see a lot of additional theorists. You'll cover more theorists in each one of those schools of thought. And where you'll cover a lot more theorists is probably in the more modern schools as well. But I just want to kind of give you a flavor of how theories in public administration have evolved and transformed and changed over the past 150, 160 or so years. That also then contributes to our understanding of public administration as a discipline. As you have seen, some of these theories grew out of public administration. They're kind of homegrown theories coming out of the field of study. Some of these other theories came from outside of public administration, sometimes very far outside of public administration, like sociology and psychology. And we then took those theories and we transformed them and we molded them to fit what we wanted to study in our public organizations. So again, as you think about this idea of public administration as an academic discipline, think about from that perspective. Do we have all completely unique theories? Did we borrow all of our theories, or is it kind of an in-between where some of our theories are borrowed, some of our theories are novel and developed, unique just to the study of public organizations? I know I've been talking for quite a while now. I apologize for that. But again, we had a lot of information to cover. At this point, though, this wraps up the discussion of theoretical perspectives, which means that you now have all the information that you need to complete the 5 scenarios on the midterm assessment. And so this information, you'll be using that again for scenario number 5. So now you have everything that you need for the midterm assessment. And then midterm assessment, again, then needs to be submitted no later than next Sunday, October the 1st. Remember, as you are completing the midterm assessment, we are looking very much at parsimony here. And so a paragraph or 2 for each one of the questions will probably suffice. You don't have to write too much. but just make sure that the answers you are providing, you can justify. There's no right or wrong answer to any of the questions. It's just a matter of you justifying why your answer is the appropriate answer for that question. Okay, let's take a break. It's 5:25. We've been going for a while. If we can, let's try and just take a 10-minute break tonight because we do have a lot of information to cover in the second half of class. So take a break. We'll say until 5:35. Come back at 5:35, and then we'll shift gears into our final major topic for the course, which will be the functions of public administration. And we'll start with the discussion of the role of public administrators in policy, as well as the role of public administrators in implementing and evaluating public programs. And then if time permits, we'll then also have a discussion about how we know and how we can determine how effective our policies and our programs are. Because at the end of the day, that is what we are trying to do as public administrators, is we are trying to implement effective public policies and public programs. So that's what we'll do in the second half of class. So coming back at 5:30, and we'll get started with that. Okay, welcome back. Break is now over, so let's move into the next stage of material that we cover in this class, which looks at the functions of public administration, where we really talk about what public administrators do and the different skills that you are going to develop in the MPA program that will hopefully help you become more effective leaders and managers in the public and nonprofit sectors. As we talked about the discipline of public administration, we talked about how the politics administration dichotomy is no longer really in effect, in that we recognize that public administrators are involved in policy formulation as well as policy implementation and policy evaluation. Public administrators have a role to play in all three of those stages of the public policy process. There's so much of a role to play that, as you've noticed, you're in a Master's of Public Administration program, but it's being provided by a Graduate Center for Public Policy and Administration. And I think that really is a nod to how important the role of formulation, implementation, evaluation of policy will be for public administrators. Now, before we get into a discussion of the role of public administrators in public policy and programs, I really think we need to kind of differentiate between what is a public policy and what is a public program. In PPA 670, you will talk about public policies. In PPA 696, you'll talk about public programs and public program evaluation. I think one of the best ways to view the difference between policies and programs is to think about it in terms of a bridge. So when you look at a bridge, you'll have the span of the bridge, and then that bridge will be held up by pillars. Think of the bridge as public policies, and then the pillars that hold that bridge up as public programs. So the overarching public policy goals will then be achieved by the implementation of the specific public programs that are meant to further the accomplishment of those policy goals. So again, the policy is the bridge, and then the stanchions that hold that bridge up, we can consider to be public policy, the public programs. So the policy is the bridge, the stanchions are the public programs. I think that's a good way to kind of differentiate between the two, and why you have a 670 class and another 696 class, and why they are taught in different settings. Now, that's how we handle it in our MPA program. There are some MPA programs across the country that will combine policy and program together into the same course, and they'll call it policy and program effectiveness or something like that. We do separate it out because there are kind of the differences in methods that you use in evaluating policies as compared to evaluating programs. So we know that public administrators have a role to play in all three of the phases of the policymaking process: formulation, implementation, and evaluation. And so we're going to break up policymaking into those three different areas: formulation, implementation, and evaluation, and talk about what happens in each one of those phases. Again, this is just a foreshadowing of what you will get in your policy class in PPA 670. So in formulation, before a policy can be created, before a policy can be formulated, it must first get onto the formal decision-making agenda of a decision-making body. And we talked about the idea of power. We talked about John Gaventa, and we talked about his study of rural Appalachia and the coal mining town. And we said one of the reasons why we didn't have coal mine safety legislation being passed in the state was because of agenda setting, because the coal mine owners had the resources, and through their campaign contributions, they were able to influence state legislators to keep coal mine safety legislation off of the state legislature's agenda. Since it never got onto the formal decision-making agenda, there could never be a law passed on coal mine safety. Agenda setting is an important part of policy formulation. Again, policy ideas must first get onto the formal decision-making agenda before a policy can be formulated. Policy formulation and agenda setting is all about decision-making. How we decide which issues are important enough for us to make laws and policies about, which issues are not important enough for us to deal with. For those issues that are important enough for us to make policies and laws about, we make decisions in terms of who's going to be affected by these policies, who's going to pay for these policies, what are the regulatory aspects of these policies. We make a lot of decisions throughout the entire policy formulation process. And public administrators, more today than ever in the past, are involved in a lot of those decisions because public administrators are the ones who have the expertise. They're the ones who are intimately aware of the issues and the problems that need to be addressed, and then the most effective ways of addressing those issues and those problems. But since policy formulation is all about decision-making, I'd like to present to you tonight 4 different decision-making models that you will use throughout your entire time in the MPA program. These decision-making models you'll use again in your org theory class, you'll use again in your 696 class, you'll use them again in your 670 course. And those 4 different decision-making models are rational comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and the 4th one is what's called the garbage can model of decision-making. Now, you're probably very familiar with rational comprehensive and incremental decision-making. In the rational comprehensive decision-making approach, we're going to be as rational as possible. And we know when we are being rational, we are taking into account all the information we possibly can and then using that information to arrive at a decision. So in the rational comprehensive decision-making approach, in step 1, we will clearly define what the problem is and clearly define our goals that we are trying to achieve with this policy. So problems and goals are clearly defined in step 1 of the rational comprehensive process. Once we've clearly defined our problem and we've clearly defined the goals that we are trying to achieve with our policy, in our second step, we will go out there and collect all of the relevant available information that will help us develop answers and solutions to the problem. The important thing here is in step 2, we collect all available information because it is a rational, comprehensive process. Once we've collected all of our information, we will then identify strategies or means that will help us achieve the goals that we've articulated in step number 1. We will generate a full range of alternatives, a full range of means, a full range of strategies that we can select from in order to achieve our goals and to solve our problem. So the important thing here in step 4 is we are putting together a full range of alternatives. Every possible alternative that there is that could solve the problem, we are going to consider in step number 4. From this full range of all the possible alternatives, we will compare them and we will then select the best alternative. That best alternative then becomes our policy approach. And that's how we come up with our policy. It's the best alternative, the best solution to the problem that we are trying to solve. We then will implement that best alternative. We'll then implement that policy. The nice thing, obviously, about this rational comprehensive approach is that you are being comprehensive, and that you're taking into account all the available information and using that information to then develop the best alternative. The best is the best, and so that's the alternative that will best solve this problem. We know the limitations, the criticisms of the rational comprehensive approach is that it's difficult for us to know what is best. Different courses of action will have different externalities. They will have different unintended consequences. And it's difficult for us sometimes to forecast what all those externalities will be. And so, okay, well, this may solve the problem, but in solving this problem, maybe we've created another problem. Or maybe we have used this money to solve this problem. We could have used it to solve another problem. So there's an opportunity cost that's involved in using our resources to solve this problem in this manner. We also know another limitation is that we are human beings. And as human beings, we have limitations upon us in terms of how rational we can be. There's a limit to our rationality. It's what Herbert Simon referred to as bounded rationality. I'll put that in text chat. Bounded rationality. So Herbert Simon says that with bounded rationality, we have cognitive limitations. There's only so much information we can acquire, only so much information that we can understand and utilize. So it's probably going to be impossible for us to collect all the available information that's out there. We just don't have the time or the cognitive ability to do it. Even if we could, we don't have the cognitive ability to analyze every single piece of information that we would collect. So it's not going to be possible then for us to select the best alternative. There may be a better alternative out there that we never even thought of. We didn't have the cognitive ability or the time or resources to develop that other alternative, that other solution. So in many instances in the public sector, we do not have the ability to be purely rational comprehensive in our decision making. So instead, we have a second decision-making model that you are probably familiar with, known as incrementalism. In incrementalism, we recognize our limitations. In step one, we recognize that goals are not easily defined and they're not easily agreed upon. So it's difficult for us to clearly identify our problem, and it's difficult for us to clearly identify our goals. It's difficult for us to get agreement among decision makers on what the problem is and what the goals are. In step number two, we don't have the cognitive ability to collect all the information out there. So we will collect as much information as we possibly can. If we're not collecting all the information out there, then it's impossible for us to say we have a full range of alternatives. So with this limited information that we are collecting, we are probably going to put together a limited range of alternative solutions. Not going to be everything. It's going to be a very limited range of solutions. What we will then do is with our limited range of solutions, we will then compare them to each other. So we'll compare solution A to solution B, and solution B to solution C, and then solution A to solution C. That's what's called limited successive comparisons. So we'll make limited successive comparisons between the different solutions that we have developed. And then we were not going to select the best alternative, the best solution, because we may not, again, have thought of that best alternative. We will select the first alternative that works for us. So we'll select the first alternative that is workable, that can address the problem we're trying to address, and that will then become the heart of this policy that we are developing, and we then implement that most appropriate rather than best solution. The advantages of incrementalism, obviously, is it's a much more realistic way of making decisions in the public sector. It recognizes our bounded rationality, our cognitive limitations, recognizes our time and resource limitations. The criticism, though, is that if we use incrementalism for everything, then we're never going to really address the root of a problem. And the difference between rational comprehensive decision-making and incrementalism is oftentimes referred to as the root versus the branch approach. So it's the root approach versus the branch approach. The root approach obviously is rational comprehensive. The branch approach is incrementalism. In rational comprehensive, we get to the root of the problem. We get to the root of the tree. In incrementalism, we're never able to get to the root of the problem. So therefore, we just deal with the branches. Root versus branch type of decision making. This distinction between root and branch decision-making, between rationality and incrementalism, comes to us from a scholar by the name of Charles Lindblom. And Charles Lindblom wrote an article many years ago in which he described incrementalism as the way in which we typically make decisions in the public sector. His article gained a great deal of acclaim. He won a lot of awards for it. He said that it wasn't any great theory that he was promulgating. He said basically he was just saying what happens in the public sector. Is that this is really just telling you descriptively, this is how public organizations tend to make their decisions. They tend to use the branch approach. They tend to use incrementalism. One area where we do a lot of incremental decision making is in the area of public budgeting. And if you look at public budgets over the course of several years, you're going to see a lot of similarities from one year to the next. And typically what we oftentimes do in incremental decision making with budgeting is we'll take what we spent money on last year, we'll add on maybe 2 or 3%, or today with cost of living, maybe 7 or 8%, and then that will be our new budget. And then we'll do the same thing next year and the same thing the year after that. The problem, obviously, with that is if you're only making small incremental changes from one year to the next, if a policy is not working, you're going to continue making those mistakes year after year after year. If you only use an incremental approach to decision making, you are never going to go back and re-justify and revisit whether or not this policy was a policy to pursue in the first place. And so you can continue to repeat small mistakes over and over again. But decision-making in the public sector tends to be a lot more incremental typically than it is rational comprehensive. But incrementalism and rational comprehensive decision-making are diametrically opposed. So you have rational comprehensive over here, and you have incrementalism over here. The question then becomes, is there anything in between? And obviously the answer to that question is yes. And that third decision-making model is what's called mixed scanning. And mixed scanning is something that comes to us from an author by the name of Amitai Etzioni. And I say that just because I like to say his name a lot, Amitai Etzioni. It's a great name. But he came up with this idea of mixed scanning. It's kind of a combination of the two. For big issues, for momentous issues, we are going to try and be as rational as we can possibly be. For smaller, more mundane day-to-day issues, we're going to save the time and money of rationality by being more incremental. So big problems, rationality; smaller problems, incrementalism. It kind of makes sense. You're kind of combining the best of both worlds. The problem with mixed scanning is it's relatively subjective. Who is to say what is a big issue versus who is to say what is a small issue? What may be a big issue for one person is a small issue for someone else, and vice versa. In the world of budgeting, a great illustration of the difference between incrementalism and rational comprehensive is when you look at different types of budgets. So in budgeting, you typically have an operating budget. That operating budget will be primarily for the day-to-day functioning of the organization. So when you're looking at a question such as buying supplies and how many staples we need next year as compared to what we needed this year, you can be incremental. You don't have to be rational comprehensive. You can make very incremental marginal decisions in terms of what types of supplies and how many supplies to buy. However, when you're looking at something like building a brand new city hall, or buying a new fleet of police vehicles, or building a new senior center, something that will probably cost tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's going to last for multiple generations, that's a much bigger issue. And those issues tend to be dealt with in what we call the capital budget, in the capital budgeting process. So operating budgets are more for the day-to-day functioning of the government. You can be a little bit more incremental in that regard. For the big ticket items, the big capital projects, those tend to be done through capital budgeting, where we tend to put more rational approach toward, where we tend to take more time, and we tend to try and collect more information and be as rational and comprehensive as possible. So that's the third approach known as mixed scanning. And then there's the fourth approach. And this is an approach that I'm a very big fan of. And it's a decision making model known as the garbage can model of decision making. Now, I love the decision making model. I hate the title of the model. The garbage can model decision making kind of makes you think you just throw things in a garbage can, mix it up, and just pull out a decision. There's more rhyme and reason to it than that. But in garbage can model of decision making, we tend to make decisions in policy at what's called the confluence of four different streams of thought. And the four different streams that converge with each other when we make policies are the streams of participants, problems, solutions, and then the final stream is what's called the choice opportunity or kind of triggering event type of stream. So the way in which we tend to make policy is the participant stream is in place, meaning that we have people in policy making positions who are predisposed to making a big change to the way in which we are addressing a problem. If you've got the people in place who are ready to make a big decision and ready to formulate a policy, then you've got what's called your participant stream. So if you have at the federal level, a president and the majorities in the House and the Senate who can agree on the nature of the problem, the definition of the problem, and then the goals that we are trying to achieve with addressing that problem, you've got your participants in place. Your second stream is your problem stream. And as John Kingdon tells us, we've kind of got what he calls a primordial soup of problems in society. That there are all these thousands upon thousands of problems that are floating around in society. What has to happen is a problem needs to kind of emerge from this primordial soup, whereby people agree that it's an important enough problem that we need to put our resources and our energy behind trying to solve this problem. And people have a general agreement about what that problem is, then that problem is ready to be solved. And that problem comes out of that problem stream. The third stream is the solution stream. We have all these pre-existing solutions that exist to address this problem. Some of those solutions may have been developed decades ago to address a different problem, but we can take those solutions from decades ago and we can apply it to the present day problem that we are trying to solve. It's kind of a non-linear approach to decision making in that solutions can actually predate problems. It's what I like to call the Quentin Tarantino approach to decision making. If you're a fan of Quentin Tarantino movies, you know that they're oftentimes non-sequential and they kind of bounce around all over the place in terms of timeline. Well, that's similar here. Solutions can predate problems. It's not a linear type of we develop the problem, then we develop the solution. We can reach back decades ago and use the solution to address today's problem. And then the fourth stream is what's called the choice opportunity stream. Sometimes it's called the triggering event or the policy window. What happens with this fourth stream is something happens, something occurs in society that galvanizes public opinion around the idea that we need to make a change to the way in which we are addressing this problem. And when that window of opportunity opens up and you've got the right participants in the place, you have a defined problem and you have a solution that will work, all four of those streams converge, they all flow together. And that is the point at which we tend to see policies made and or big changes made to the way in which we've been addressing a problem or a policy. So let me give you a couple of examples. So here's one tragic example that I oftentimes use, and that's an example of this value jet crash that occurred back, I believe it was in 1994, I believe it was. And in 1996, actually, in 1996, we had this value jet that crashed in the Florida Everglades, killing 110 people. It was value jet number 582. That was a triggering event that then galvanized public opinion around the idea that we need to address this problem of airline safety. We had consumer rights groups. We had members of Congress who were ready to make a big decision to address airline safety. The problem in airline safety was that in this value jet crash, the cause of the crash was a fire that broke out in the plane. And actually, what happened is the fire had started in the cargo bay of the plane. And then by the time the fire was noticeable to the crew, it has already burned through electrical systems and made the plane unrecoverable, and the plane then crashed into Florida Everglades. So we realized there was a problem that undetected fires in the cargo bay of planes can lead to these types of airline disasters. The solution was a pre-existing solution, and that solution was installing smoke detectors. We did not invent smoke detectors in 1996 to address this problem. They have been around for decades. But instead, what we did is we passed a policy that required the placement of smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes in order to address this problem of the undetected fire on board a plane. So all four of those streams all flowed together to give us this new policy that required smoke detectors in the cargo bay of planes. On a different topic, in the mid 1990s, we had this Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as welfare reform. Welfare reform, we again had participants in place who were ready to make a change to the policy. We had a Democratic president and a Republican majority in the House and the Senate that agreed that we needed to move people from welfare to work. They viewed the welfare problem as being a problem in which it was a self-perpetuating system where generation after generation will remain on welfare. So we knew we had to move people from welfare into work. So we had an agreement among the participants on essentially what the problem was. The solution that we used was a solution known as a block grant. And we replaced AFDC grants with these new grants known as Temporary Assistance to Needy Family Grants. TANF grants allowed state governments to spend the money in any way that they felt necessary in order to reduce welfare rolls. So if they wanted to spend that money on job training, they could do that. If they want to spend that money on computer literacy programs, they could do that as well. But it gave them a lot more flexibility with a block grant in how they spent the money to move what people from welfare to work. Again, the TANF grant was a block grant that had been developed several decades earlier to address a different problem, but we reached back in time and took a block grant and applied it to a present day type of situation. That's the example of a garbage can model of decision making. I think garbage can model decision making makes a lot of sense in the way in which we formulate policies in this country. You have to have the right people in decision making positions who are predisposed to make a change. You have to have a problem that is agreed upon and relatively clearly defined. You have to have solutions which can be pre-existing solutions that can be applied to the problem. And you have to have public opinion behind you. There must be a groundswell of public opinion to support making this type of change in policy. And that's when our big changes in policy formulation tend to occur. But I would say to hold on to those four different decision-making models: rational, comprehensive, incrementalism, mixed scanning, and garbage can, because you're going to return to those in future courses as you take public policy analysis in 670, as well as program evaluation in 696. So we have to formulate the policy, and typically we oftentimes do it through kind of a garbage can model decision making. But we know that when policies are formulated, they are oftentimes formulated in a very vague and ambiguous manner. As we have said before, in order to get a majority of Congress to agree to a policy, that policy cannot have a whole lot of details. So the details then have to be hammered out when we get to the implementation stage. And that's where public administrators are involved in the administrative rulemaking process. If you've been involved in any types of rulemaking, you understand what the administrative rulemaking process is. That agencies will have to write the rules that will then govern the implementation of that policy. So for example, if it's a grant policy, they have to write the implementation rules for when the grants will be distributed, for how the applications for those grants will be submitted, for what the review process will look like. Those are all done under this administrative rulemaking process. The administrative rulemaking process is open to the public and open to public scrutiny. And so members of the public can submit written comments to proposed rules. The federal level proposed rules have to be published in advance in the Federal Register. People can then respond to those proposed rules either in written form or they can appear at a open public hearing and can then make comments about those rules at that public hearing. So you have to have a lot of that public input in making those types of rules to govern the implementation of that policy. So public administrators are not only involved in formulating the policy, they're also involved in formulating the rules that will govern the implementation of that policy as well. Implementation of policy is a very difficult business. And we know that even the best designed policy can fail if it is not properly implemented by the implementers, by the administrators. And there are a lot of barriers to proper implementation of public policies. There's a very famous study by Pressman and Wildowski, Jeffrey Pressman and Aaron Wildowski, that was written many years ago back, I believe it's in the 1970s, that documents the implementation of one federal policy in Oakland, California. And in their documentation of the implementation of this policy in Oakland, California, what the authors found is that there are multiple obstacles, multiple barriers to proper implementation. And what President Wildowski found is that some of the barriers to proper implementation of public policies included multiple goals. Sometimes those policies had multiple conflicting goals. And so implementers didn't know which goal to pursue because there are multiple goals and they conflicted with each other. The more decisions that were left to the implementers in the implementation process, the less successful implementation tended to be. So the more decisions left to implementers, the less successful implementation was. The intensity of implementers, how much implementers believed in the policy, how strongly they supported the policy, would also have an impact upon the success of implementation. Obviously, if they felt strongly in favor of this policy, they would work harder to implement it and implementation would be more successful. The amount of bargaining that was involved in implementation also had an impact upon implementation success. The more bargaining that went on in terms of how the policy was going to be implemented, the less successful implementation of that policy tended to be. And then the creation of agencies. Sometimes when the federal government relies on state governments to implement policies, they will create new agencies that will serve as an ally to the state government in helping the state government implement that policy. Oftentimes, when you have these agencies created, they provide the support to the state government that can sometimes make it easier to implement the policy as long as they're not working at cross purposes. But there are a lot of problems that are associated with implementation. As we said, even the best designed policies can fail if not properly implemented. One of the biggest barriers, though, is this idea of the intensity of participant support, the intensity of implementer support. What President Wildowski found is that when you had implementers who were not only feeling positive toward the policy, but they felt strongly positive, they were very big supporters of the policy, those were the types of implementations that had very minimal delays, where there was no bargaining. They essentially got properly and successfully implemented in very short order. If you had a situation where you had implementers who were very much opposed to the policy, so they had a very high negative intensity in terms of their opposition to the policy, that's where most of your delays come from. That's where you have a whole lot of bargaining over all the essential aspects of the policy. That's a policy that probably is not going to end up being implemented. If you have implementers who support the policy, but not very strongly, you'll have some minor delays, but typically you not have to have a whole lot of bargaining. It will eventually get implemented. It'll just be kind of a protracted, delayed implementation. If you have implementers who are opposed to the policy, but not a very strong opposition to the policy, you'll get some moderate delays. You'll get some bargaining, but not bargaining about the essentials of the policy. Again, it will slow down the implementation of the policies more so than if you have people supporting the policy. But chances are, once that bargaining over peripherals is done, it will probably end up getting implemented. But the intensity of the support of implementers is probably the primary determinant of successful policy implementation. So if you have administrators who do not support a policy, there are a lot of ways in which they can drag their feet and make it difficult to get this policy implemented correctly and on time. The way in which you get implementers, administrators to support the implementation of a policy is by involving them. The more that they are involved in policy formulation, the more buy-in they're going to have in that policy. So by allowing them to participate in formulation, by allowing them to participate in writing the rules that will govern implementation, you will then greatly enhance your chances of successful implementation. And that comes to us from Martha Durthick. It's kind of an old maximum policy implementation. Involving implementers will get their buy-in and will then make for more successful policy implementation. But obviously, there's a major role for public administrators to play in implementing these policies. And there's also a major role for administrators to play in the evaluation of policies as well. Obviously, we want to make sure that the policies that we are implementing are effective, that the policies that we are implementing are achieving their stated goals and objectives. So we want to evaluate policies when they are ready to be evaluated and provide that type of formative feedback. The problem is we oftentimes try to evaluate policies too early. We try and evaluate policies before they are ready to be evaluated. So one approach that we oftentimes use in policy evaluation is what's called an evaluability assessment, where we will assess the readiness of the program, of the policy to be evaluated. Sometimes with policies, it will take some time before the outcomes of those policies will actually manifest themselves. You may need to wait 6 months. You may need to wait a year before you can properly evaluate that policy. Evaluating a policy too soon will doom that policy then obviously to failure. But as you go through your 670 class, you will talk about these 3 different stages of policy: formulation, implementation, and evaluation, and how there are prominent roles for public administrators in all 3 of those stages of public policy analysis. But in addition to having the function of formulating, implementing, and evaluating public policies, public administrators are also intimately involved in the formulation, implementation, and evaluation of these public programs that support these overarching public policy goals. So in your 696 class, you will talk primarily about what administrators do in evaluating the success of these public programs that are, again, designed to support the goals of the overarching policy. So, give you another example of the relationship between policies and programs. Say, for instance, you have a policy for educating at-risk youth. And so one of the goals of the policy is to educate 20% more at-risk youth than, increase the graduation rate of at-risk youth by 20% this year as compared to last year. And that's your overall policy goal for this policy of educating at-risk youth. How you're actually going to do it will be your programs. And so you may have a after-school basketball program to engage them in school and to get them to stay in school. That may be a program that can help them then achieve that 20% increase in graduation rates. Maybe you'll have a tutoring program, an after-school tutoring program. That program will then help contribute to that increase of graduation rates of 20%. So you have these individual programs that will then support the overall policy of educating at-risk youth and that policy goal of increasing graduation rates by 20%. So in your 696 class, you will look at how do we evaluate these programs, these individual public programs. Now, I know 696 is called research methods. I think I had mentioned to you before that even though it's called research methods, it's really a program evaluation course. And what we've done with 696 is we have moved away from classic social science research type of course. And now we're talking about how we take those social science research methods and apply them and put them in the service of the evaluation of public programs. That's why we don't do statistics anymore in PPA 696. We talk about them more from an application perspective, but we don't get into the calculation of statistics, and why we require you to have met the undergraduate statistics prerequisite before you can then take 696, because our focus really is much more on program evaluation. So what is program evaluation, and what do administrators do when they evaluate these public programs in their organizations? Program evaluation, the primary purpose is to apply empirical methods to determine the effectiveness of a public program. So one of the main parts of that definition is this term empirical, to apply empirical methods. When we use the word empirical, we are talking about something that is tangible. We're talking about collecting data, collecting information that is tangible enough that we can analyze, we can, I don't want to say manipulate, but we can analyze it, we can measure it, we can use it then to reach conclusions about program evaluation. Empirical can be both quantitative as well as qualitative. And sometimes people will make the mistake of thinking empirical methods are only numbers-based. They're only quantitative in nature, and that's not true. They can be both quantitative as well as qualitative in nature. When we do program evaluations, we can look at either the impact of the program in a program impact evaluation, and or we can look at the implementation of the program in a program implementation evaluation. So in a program impact evaluation, we're asking the question, is this program having the outcome that we wanted to have? Is it achieving the goal that we wanted to achieve? If, for instance, we have an income subsidy program that is meant to increase the disposable income of households under a certain income level, the question is it having its desired impact? Is it actually increasing the disposable income of households under that income eligibility level? In the implementation evaluation, we're actually going to look at how we're implementing the program to see from an efficiency perspective, are we implementing the program in an efficient manner? Are we utilizing the resources in this program in order to implement it as efficiently as we can? Now, sometimes you'll combine the two together, and you can certainly do an impact and implementation evaluation together in one program evaluation. So how do we do program evaluation in public administration? The steps we go through in program evaluation are going to very closely track and mirror the steps that we go through in classic social science research methods. So our first step is going to be identify our purpose, to identify our evaluation question. Our evaluation question is usually going to look at the effectiveness of the program, and it's oftentimes going to follow the same parameters as a research question would in the social sciences. It needs to be clear, it needs to be answerable, and it needs to have more than one possible answer. So a program can be effective in achieving its goals, it can be partially effective, it can be ineffective. There are more than one possible answer for that program evaluation question. So here are some examples of some evaluation questions that come straight from a 696 case that was used in directed research a few years ago. And that 696 case revolved around the use of what's called the Inmate Reading Intervention Program, or otherwise known as IRIP. And this public program, we were providing a reading intervention to incarcerated individuals, with the idea being that by participating in these reading intervention programs, increasing literacy rates, it would then have a positive impact on decreasing recidivism, to decrease reoffending rates. So one way you could ask the evaluation question, does the inmate reading intervention program decrease rates of recidivism? Essentially, is it achieving the goal it is supposed to achieve? Now, in classic social science research, we oftentimes try to avoid those types of questions, those either or types of questions. Oftentimes in classic social science research, we try and ask more the how questions, because a how question will develop more robust data than an is type of question. So another way you could ask the question is, how does the inmate reading intervention program affect rates of recidivism? That how question is a non-directional question. We're just asking, how does it affect? The question above that is much more of a directional question. We're asking, does it decrease rates of recidivism? But that's kind of the idea behind an evaluation question. It needs to be clear, needs to be answerable with empirical data, and needs to have more than one possible answer. As you know, another important step in classic social science research is to clearly identify your variables and the indicators you're going to measure for those variables. As you know, in social science research, we are typically looking at relationships between independent and dependent variables. The dependent variable is the variable that is being changed in program evaluation. That is usually the result of the program. The independent variable is the variable that is affecting the dependent variable. Our primary independent variable in program evaluation will be some measure of the program itself. Either whether or not someone participated in the program, the amount of time they spent participating in the program, that will be the measure of our primary independent variable. So we want to see how participation in the program affected our dependent variable of recidivism rates. Then we're also going to use control variables, as you know, in order to try and isolate the relationship between the program and its intended outcome, between the primary independent variable and the dependent variable. So our control variables are going to be other independent variables that may also affect the dependent variable. So there are other things that could also affect recidivism rates. One type of control variable could be whether or not it was a crime that involved drug use, because we know that crimes that involve drug use tend to have much higher reoffending rates than crimes that do not involve drug use. We may want to look at control variables such as the number of previous incarcerations, because we know number of previous incarcerations oftentimes has an impact upon rates of reoffending. So those are variables we'll want to control, parcel out of our equation so that we can isolate and focus on the true impact of the inmate reading intervention program on recidivism rates. So a very similar type of approach that we would use in classic social science research. Our third step then is to select our research design. Now, you know from your undergraduate research courses that there are different types of research designs that can be used. There are experimental designs and there are also quasi-experimental designs. Experimental evaluation designs are the ones that use random assignment, in that we are randomly assigning our subjects to either an experimental group or a control group. And here's one of the differences in the terminology that's used in program evaluation. So in classic social science research methods, we refer to the experimental group as this group in which will be exposed to the independent variable. So this would be the group that participates in the public program. And in social science research, we call that the experimental group. In program evaluation, we oftentimes refer to it as the project group. So the project group will be the group that actually participates in the program. They're the ones who are exposed to the program as the independent variable. Then we can randomly assign people to what in social science research we call the control group. And that control group will be people who do not participate in the program. In program evaluation, we oftentimes refer to the control group as the comparison group. So in social science, it's experimental versus control group. In program evaluation, it tends to be project versus comparison group. And in experimental designs, we will use random assignments. So we will randomly assign some people to our project group and then randomly assign other people to our comparison group. The advantage of randomly assigning some people to participate and some people not to participate in the program is equivalence. You then have equivalence between your two groups. The only difference then between your project group and your comparison group is participation in the program. Now, obviously, that's the ideal in an experimental design. we oftentimes cannot use random assignment in our types of program evaluations because we oftentimes do not have control over who participates versus who does not participate. There can be ethical questions if we deny someone who's eligible to participate in a program, if we deny them participation for the mere purpose of a program evaluation. That would probably be unethical if they're legally entitled to participate in that program. So oftentimes we can't use these types of experimental designs, such as classic experimental designs, like that one that's noted up there. The R stands for random assignment. The O stands for an observation. This is where collecting data on our dependent variable. The X stands for participation in the program, the independent variable. And then the second O stands for a post-observation, where we collect data about the impacts after they have participated in the program. So the first O kind of serves as a pre-observation. So it's an observation that occurs before they participate in the program. So ROXO would be our project group. ROO, without the participation in the program, would then be our comparison group. And that's a classic experimental design. Sometimes you've got these things called Solomon four-group designs, where you add on a couple of additional categories of groups there. You'll see in addition to the two we've already mentioned, you then have a third group, an RXO group, people randomly assigned to not receive a pre-observation, but participate in the program, then get a post-observation. And then a fourth group, which is another comparison group, randomly assigned, and they only get a post-observation. You can see some of the different manifestations. For this class, I'm not that concerned about you telling me about classical and Solomon four-group and those specific types of designs. For this class, I'm more concerned about you knowing the difference between an experimental design and a quasi-experimental design. Experimental designs use random assignment. Quasi-experimental designs do not use random assignment. And so in program evaluation, typically we are unable to use an experimental design because we cannot control who participates. People tend to self-select whether or not to participate in public programs. So instead, we'll use a quasi-experimental design. In a quasi-experimental design, since you cannot randomly assign, you will then create equivalency between your project and comparison group with the use of statistics. This is where we use our control variables. And so we'll develop control variables to make sure that our two groups are equivalent on every measure except for our project group participated in the program and our comparison group did not participate in the program. One of the most common types of quasi-experimental designs that we use in program evaluation is what's called a longitudinal time series analysis, whereby we will measure our data over a period of time, where we will look for patterns in our data over that period of time. Anytime you have a variable that may change in value over time, you typically want to use a longitudinal type of study to capture those changes over time. But again, the takeaway for our purposes is typically we have to use a quasi-experimental as opposed to an experimental design because we oftentimes do not control who participates in the programs and when they participate in the programs or even how they participate in those public programs. If they are legally entitled to the benefits of the program, they get the benefits of the program. We can't deny people from getting the benefits they're legally entitled to just for the purposes of our evaluation design. Also in program evaluation, just like in social science research, we have to determine where we're going to get our information from in order to answer our evaluation question. This is a process known as sampling. We typically do not have the resources to collect data from every single person who participates in a broad-scale public program. We could have millions of people who are participating in a public program. We don't have the fiscal or the time or really the wherewithal in order to be able to collect information from every single participant. So we will construct a subset of that population, as you know, called a sample. And the goal is that sample will be representative of the population. The more representative the sample is, the better we can then generalize and extrapolate the results from our evaluation to a larger population. Here again, there are two different approaches that we can use to constructing a sample. There's probability sampling and there's non-probability sampling. In probability sampling, we are going to use random sampling to determine where we're getting our information from, to determine who will be involved in our sample for this program evaluation. And when we use the word random, what we are saying is that it is a random sample if each subject has an equal non-zero chance of being selected to serve in the sample. So if everyone in the population has an equal non-zero chance of being picked for the sample, that's what we consider to be a random sample. Some examples of probability sampling, random sampling, are things such as simple random sampling. Simple random sampling will get a list of everyone in our population. We'll then randomly select people from that list to then make our sample. That simple random sampling really is very much random in that people have a random non-zero chance of being selected. So that's the most random approach we can use, is simple random. Sometimes we use something called stratified random sampling, where if there is some variable that we want to divide our sample up according to, we might use stratified random sampling. So an example could be if we want to study senior citizens in a senior care facility and the reasons why they fell, then we may want to stratify our sample according to those who fell versus those who did not fall. That would be a stratified random sample. And then we randomly select people who fell, or though we have reports that they fell, and we randomly select a sample of people who do not have reports of falling. A systematic sampling is a variation of random sampling where we don't have a list of everyone who's using the program. So you think of an example such as a local health clinic. So you have a local health clinic and people are using the services of this local health clinic, and they're using these services on an anonymous basis. So you don't know who's using the services. You have no identity of these people who are using the services. So as a researcher, as an evaluator, you could stand outside the local health clinic, and then maybe you'll interview every 10th person or every 20th person who leaves the clinic. That's called a systematic sampling type of design. The one we usually see used in program evaluation is what's called multi-stage cluster sampling. Multi-stage cluster sampling is used frequently by the US Census Bureau when they are not doing their every 10-year enumeration of the population as required in the Constitution. They will use multi-stage cluster sampling. So say, for instance, you want to put together a sample of households. The problem is you don't have a list of every household in the state of California. So what you might do is you might start at the county level. So you'll select a random sample of counties. Then from each of those counties that you selected, you'll then select a random sample of cities. Then from each of those cities you selected, you'll then select a random sample of neighborhoods. Then from every one of those neighborhoods, you'll then select a random sample of streets. And then from that random sample of streets, you'll then select a random sample of households on those streets. That's a way in which you've done multi-stage cluster sampling. There's random selection at every single stage of that process. It's a very common approach in program evaluation. Sometimes we are not able to randomly sample. And when we can't randomly sample, we will use a non-probability type of sampling design, something such as convenience sample. So if I want to know what MPA students think of PPA 500, I will ask you because we're all together here on a Monday evening. And so I'll just ask all of you because we're all in the Zoom session together. Are you representative of the rest of the MPA population? I don't know. Maybe you are, maybe you are not, but you're convenient. And so that's why I'm using you as the sample. Obviously, that may not be very representative. And so it may give us challenges in generalizing the results of our program evaluation to a larger population of all MPA students. Another non-probability technique that's used a lot, especially in social service program evaluation, is what's known as the snowballing technique. In snowballing, if you have a hard-to-reach population, you will do a referral type of method. So if you have people who are homeless, you'll then come across one person who's homeless, you will then ask them to participate, and then you'll ask them to refer you to someone else who also lacks affordable housing. and then you'll go and interview that person, and then you'll ask them to refer you to someone else, and so on and so on. Hence the reason why it's called snowballing. The more referrals you get, the larger and larger your sample will become. We then have to collect data from that sample that we have created. In program evaluation, we oftentimes use a lot of survey-based research. And so we'll use questionnaires and we'll send surveys out to our program participants to assess what services they are getting, how satisfied they are with those services, and how those services are then contributing to the outcome that we're trying to achieve with that public program. Secondary data is also very common in public program evaluation. If there are already existing data sets that are collected at the level of measurement that you are interested in, you can certainly save yourself a lot of time in your program evaluation by relying upon some of that secondary data. Secondary data will be data that have been collected by other program evaluators for some other purpose at some other point in time. Once you have your data, obviously you will analyze the data just like you would do in social science research. That means the use of statistics. Depending upon the purpose of your evaluation, there are different categories of analysis you can use. There's descriptive statistics, and descriptive statistics are used for a very descriptive program evaluation. So if you want to evaluate how many people in this community are using this program, that's a very descriptive type of analysis. There's associational analysis as well, where you want to look at associations between variables. So if you want to see how many people or what percentage of people who are using this program are below a certain income level, you're associating use of the program with that income level. That's an associational type of research. Typically, in a program impact type of evaluation, we are doing causal-based research. We are looking at how does participation in the program affect this type of an outcome? And so we're doing that type of causal research. We do approaches such as regression analysis, specifically multiple regression analysis. And so multiple regression analysis is a very common analytical tool that we frequently use in public program evaluation. And obviously the final step will then be to take all this information and then to use it to arrive at our conclusions about how effective the program is, how effective participation in the program is at reducing poverty levels, or at helping people get jobs, or increasing people's quality of life and standards of living. Those are the types of conclusions that we'll arrive at based upon the empirical evidence we have collected and we have analyzed in our program evaluations. It is very important for us to engage in program evaluation because we should be promoting effective programs. And if a program that we are implementing is ineffective, if it's not achieving its stated goal and objective, then obviously we want to reorient our resources into another program that may be more effective and do a better job of achieving our goals and our objectives. So to do a good job in program evaluation, we have to know what we mean by effective programs. We have to know what we mean by the term effectiveness. And so where we typically go from here in our discussion is to present you with 4 different models of measuring effectiveness, both program effectiveness as well as organizational effectiveness. Because at the end of the day, this is what we are trying to do as public administrators, is we're trying to make our programs as well as our organizations as effective as possible. The 4 different models that we tend to use are the goal approach, goal attainment approach, systems resource approach, participant satisfaction approach, and internal process approach to defining effectiveness. We only have 5 minutes left, so we clearly do not have time to go through these 4 different models tonight, but this is what we'll pick up with next Monday. We'll start talking about effectiveness in program evaluation, and we'll talk about these 4 different models, what they are, and I'll provide you with examples of these 4 different models of measuring effectiveness in the public sector. And then we'll move into a discussion of managing human resources as another function that public administrators engage in. And then in the last half of class next week, we'll move into a discussion of managing fiscal resources as another function that we do in public administration. And that will then round out all the information that we typically cover in this introductory 500 course. But before we do all that next week, at the beginning of class next week, I'll also pull up the final assessment and I'll quickly walk you through the 5 scenarios and all the questions on the final assessment to show you what you are doing and what my expectations are for each one of those scenarios and each of those questions. So that's our agenda for next week. We'll see how far we get next week. Hopefully we'll be able to cover all that information. If not, then we will make the necessary adjustments we need to make in terms of submission date for our final assessment. Okay, I know that was a lot. I know that I've been talking now for 2 hours and 40 minutes or so, so I apologize for it. But again, a lot of information to get in a very compacted schedule this semester. So any basic questions or observations on any of this information that we have covered over the course of this evening?
I do have a question, Professor. In terms of the research models, you said for sake of this class, what is it that we need to pretty much understand?
Yeah, good question. For the sake of this class, when we are getting into things such as the different types of research designs, you don't have to know all the specific types of designs. Just kind of know the difference between experimental designs and quasi-experimental designs. Experimental designs, we can use random assignment. Quasi-experimental designs, we cannot. And typically in program evaluation, we tend to use quasi-experimental designs because we cannot randomly assign people to participate or not participate in a program. And then also here, when we're talking about putting a sample together, you don't have to know all the specific sampling designs, just know the difference between probability and non-probability. In a probability design, we're using random sampling. Everyone has an equal non-zero chance of being selected. In non-probability, we're not able to do that. And so therefore, we're going to just use convenience or some other approach that doesn't require a random selection of people to participate in our evaluation. So kind of, just kind of know the highlights between the different categories rather than knowing each of the specific types of designs.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, my pleasure. It's a good question. As a 500 class, we are an introduction class. And so therefore we do kind of just hit that tip of the iceberg and just kind of give you a little sense of what you're going to be covering, the type of information that you'll be covering throughout your time in the MPA program. So this is very much kind of a ramping up into the MPA program. So we don't get into a whole lot of detail. We don't have expectations for a lot of the details of this information. All those details will get filled in as you move through your remaining core courses in the program. Good. Anything else before we call the night? Okay. I will have this recording posted up on our Canvas site as always by tomorrow morning, so you can go back and review this information. If you have any questions about any of this information after you review the video, always feel free to reach out to me, send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions, provide any clarifications that you feel will be needed. And then next week, we'll continue on with our discussion of functions with our different models of effectiveness, managing human resources, and then managing fiscal resources to wrap up all of our information for the term. Okay, I hope everyone has a good evening. Everyone has a really good week, and then we'll be back at it next Monday and hopefully get through all of our information. If not, we'll get through what we can. Okay, take care, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.